So since the last episode, I've done quite a lot of work to get this prepared for the next stage, which is to get the frets dressed. I've given the headstock the additional coats of lacquer that it needed to get that decal covered up properly, and that's all done nicely. I've spent quite a bit of time sanding the neck down to a nice smooth finish, getting it polished up nice and shiny. Considering this lacquer hasn't really been on that long, it has polished up quite nicely. I also took the time to start getting a little bit of oil into the fretboard because it was looking very, very dry. And I've made sure that the neck was nice and straight with my notched straight edge. Just giving it a tiny little bit of truss rod to pull that straight. And then I've gone down the fretboard and just taped off the frets so that we're not going to cause any damage to that fretboard in the next steps. And then I've added a coat of black to all of the frets. Because what I'd like to get done in this episode is to kind of do a bit of a deep dive into what I do with my frets once we're at this stage. Now hopefully the frets have gone in nice and evenly and this won't be too much of a job to do. Now I'm going to start off with this fret dressing file. It's actually from Crimson and it is a nice bit of kit. It does a good job of getting the frets down to a nice kind of level situation quite quickly. And then I've got a fret leveling beam again from Crimson, and this has got some 220 and 320 kind of self-adhesive paper on, which I will use to kind of do the initial cleaning up. From the 320 we can go into recrowning these and getting the fret ends done, but let's not get too far ahead of ourselves at this stage. So quite simply, the first stage of this is just to take this file and kind of work my way up and down and across the fretboard. And what I'm looking for is, and you'll probably be able to see, I'm kind of down on most of these, but there's one or two of them. There's one there, and there's one there, and then this kind of last fret. There's still a little bit of black, but so far I've kind of taken one pass along the whole of the frets and we've got that mostly where we need it. So I'll just focus on getting that last few bits done. And that very quickly is down to level, and I'm happy to say I've hardly taken any material off at all, which is brilliant. So from there, I'm just going to take the file marks out with the rougher grit of paper. And then clean up again with the smoother stuff. And for me, that is the ideal situation. I've got all of the black out. There are a couple where there's some black still, but there is just the faintest of bright line. So I'm happy with that because it means I'm removing absolutely minimal material. These aren't the biggest of frets. They're not like jumbo frets or anything. So the least I can take off the better, because it's going to leave me plenty of meat to play with for further fret work should it require it. And with that done, we can once again get some black onto these frets. I've got a new magic marker. It works really well, but it's massive. He's getting ink everywhere, but I'm sure we'll be fine. And we'll just give that a few seconds to dry out. It's not the warmest in the shed today, so it might take a little bit of time. But once it has dried, we can move on to the next stage. I'll turn it around for that. Which is to put the crown back on these, because even though I've taken a minimal amount of material off, it has actually kind of flattened the top of the fret off a little bit, which some people actually like, but I'm not a fan of. I like to have as minimal contact area in the middle as possible. So to do that, we will need to recrown them. And there's a couple of files that I use to do this. although I don't often use this one. This is a kind of a concave fret crowning file. And if you can see there, it's got a concave face cut into it with kind of file teeth on. And it's okay, I don't mind using it, but it's not my favourite way of doing it. I much prefer good old-fashioned triangular file. And you can see here, this one's had the teeth ground off the corners, so that's not going to dig in to your fretboard or anything. Again, this is from Crimson, and all I do is start one side, taking strokes from alternate sides. Just work that fret material kind of back into shape until you're left with just a very, very fine, thin line right the way down the centre of the fret. It's sometimes better to kind of angle the fretboard while you're doing it, just to get the light where you need it to see that you are getting that kind of straight line. So I'll work my way up the rest of the board, get all of these to the same state, and I'll join you back when that's done. Now I can hear a load of you saying, hold on a minute, you've just used a load of tools that you wouldn't have had when you started building guitars. And this is true, but there's a couple of reasons why I'm doing this. Firstly, fretwork is really, really important, so I'm not going to compromise one of the most important parts of this build just to prove a point. And secondly, I did have a very similar set of tools when I did this. They just looked a little bit different. So we'll get back on the bench and we'll have a look and see what I used back in the old days. So rather than this fancy levelling file, all I used was a plain old file with the handle taken off, and that was slid up and down the fretboard in exactly the same manner. In the place of the levelling beam, I simply used a small level that I taped some abrasive paper to. Now, I've been using this level to do that job up until quite recently. I think I've only had this levelling beam for the last couple of years, and this level absolutely worked fine. The only issue with it really is that it's a little bit too long for the job, but other than that, it's absolutely fine. I didn't have my three-cornered crowning file. I do love that thing, but I did have the little concave one that I showed you earlier. I actually bought this for my first build. It was one of the few tools that I did buy, and instead of the fret end dressing file, which we will be getting to before very much longer, I just had a small triangular file that you might be able to see there. I've ground the edge off just to give me a safe edge for that job. So a different set of tools, but very, very similar in many ways as well. And with that little public service announcement out of the way, we can crack back on with the neck. And the next job is to get these fret ends sorted out, because as it stands, they're actually fairly sharp and you wouldn't really want to play this neck for more than a few seconds. However, it is a relatively easy, if a little time consuming, to get these sorted out. And all we're going to do is just clean these fret ends up into a much nicer shape. Now, a lot of factory built guitars in particular, they tend to have frets that are chamfered off and then kind of just a little bit of cleaning up work done, and you get that kind of angled edge. And that works. There's nothing wrong with that. I, however, like to kind of put a hemispherical end on, just because I think they look nicer. And to be honest, it doesn't really take that much longer to do it. However, there is an important technique, and it's a technique that took me a little bit of time to learn, but once I'd got it, it's an absolute game changer. The reason we're doing this is you don't want that sharpness. You don't want to feel the end of the fret because it's uncomfortable, and in some cases they're sharp enough to cut you. So we want to get rid of that. But what you're actually feeling and I'll bring you in much closer to see this as we go along, but you're actually feeling the corner of the fret wire right as it meets the edge of the fretboard, and in this case the binding. That is where the sharpness comes from, and if you can get rid of that, a lot of your problems go away. So the first thing I do is I take the square edge of this fret dressing file and I just get right in that corner and take that material out. And instantly that feels a lot better. Then what I'll do is I'll flip it over so we've got this more kind of rounded edge, and I'll just roll that over into that hemispherical shape that we're after. Now it doesn't have to be kind of brilliant at this stage. We'll go back and we'll clean this all up much better as we go along. So again, in the close-up, right into that corner, and you notice I've got kind of a downward angle going on there. Just take out that sharp corner of the fret, and then with the rolling action, just work your way around the fret and put the shape that you want in. And then, like I say, I'll just work my way up the rest of the fretboard. And I'm definitely not going to film all of this because it would be very boring. Okay, so that's all of the fret ends done, and probably took about 25 minutes to go down both sides of the fretboard. It is a long, involved job. However, it is an absolutely essential one. So with that done, we're a couple of steps away from getting this finished off. Now these days, when I get to this stage, it's the point where I break out my fret erasers, which again are from Crimson. Getting them a lot of plugs in this time. But basically it's rubber with abrasives embedded into it, and I've got them in coarse, medium, fine and super fine. And I use these to just kind of rub down my frets, and they're very good at kind of taking out all of the little marks, file marks, tooling marks, call it what you will, that are in the fret without taking out any more kind of material or more material than we'd want to. Didn't have those on my first build. I am going to use them, probably use them off camera because you don't need to see me scrubbing away for hours on those. You can do the same thing with wet and dry paper. Works just as well. Some might say it works even better. And what you need to remember is, from here, I'm going to use very fine grades of wet and dry. So I'm going to go with 400 as my roughest. And all I'm doing is, I'm just, with a finger, very gently running that up and down the fretboard. I'm not really removing any material beyond the fine scratches, and if you remember, we went with 320 grit on the beam as the last grade, so we're not taking out that bigger scratches. And you can see it took me a few seconds to go up and down there. Then I'll go with some 800. Do exactly the same. And then finally, do you know what? I'm not going to use the erasers. I'll just use some 1200. Just spend a little bit of time finishing off those fret ends the same way. And you can probably see there, they've already started to take on quite a nice sheen. And if you run your fingernail across them, there's no scratches or anything catching my fingernail as I run through. These are now ready for polishing. And what did I do on my first build to polish these? I did exactly as I do these days. I break out my Dremel because I've had a Dremel in my tool collection for a very, very long time. And we will just quickly use that to run up and down these frets. And all I've got here is a bog standard Dremel. Other brands are available and usually cheaper. And I've got these cotton polishing mops. I got this set off Amazon for about £2.50, and there's literally hundreds of them in there, and plenty of spare mandrels should you need them. You can buy specific kind of polishing paste to go with your Dremel. I don't bother with that. You can use Autosol, any kind of chrome cleaner, metal polish. I just use this honing compound. It's what I use when I'm stropping my chisels and plane blades, and it works really, really well. And it's just a case of load a bit of the polish onto the mop, give it a polish, and I'm running my finger on that. It's barely warm. Give it a clean up with a paper towel, and that looks absolutely amazing. Okay, so they're all nicely polished up now, looking absolutely lovely, feeling really smooth, and the fret ends are awesome as well. So now begins the long job of getting all this tape off. Now what I normally do is I'll run a length of tape right the way along both edges, and then I'll tape over that. I admit it, I totally forgot this time, so I've gone over the top of the tape, which isn't going to have anywhere near the same impact, because normally I can just pull this off and the majority of the tape over the fretboard will come off with it. My bad, completely forgot. But I'll work my way through it and I'll get back to you once I've done it. Okay, and there we have the final look at this, all nicely polished up, and a fair amount of oil's gone into that board now, and it is looking luscious and dark and feels a lot smoother to the touch too, which is great. So next up for this is to start to get this neck assembled and to get it fastened onto the body so we can actually do a bit of setting up and get this playing. But that's going to be for the next episode. I think we've covered more than enough for this one. So I'll be back in a couple of days' time for the final episode in this series, where we'll get to hear what this thing sounds like. So until then, don't forget to hit the like button if you've enjoyed this, subscribe if you haven't already done so, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks a lot for watching. Bye bye.